On the day I lost my baby, my husband didn't come to the hospital. He was busy getting high with the man who pushed me. They told me it was an accident, that I tripped on the stairs, that maybe I was dizzy from the pregnancy. But I remember every detail, the way my arm grazed the banister, the sudden weight of a body behind me, the crash, the blood, the scream that never made it out of my throat. I remember lying on cold tiles, one hand on my belly, the other grasping at a name that would never be spoken again. And when I woke up, the nurse looked at me like she knew, like she'd seen women like me before, broken alone, sent back to the world with a bandage and a silence. I called my mother. I asked her to come. She said, "Chua cho chua lay. Venha jima lamlai." That was the moment I realized I had no home to return to. Not really. Only a house where I was given away like a problem that had to be solved. A house where silence was more valuable than truth, where a husband's addiction was less shameful than a daughter's rebellion. I didn't tell anyone this story for nearly 20 years, not because I was ashamed, but because for a long time, I thought no one would care. But today, I want to say it out loud, not for pity, not for justice, just so someone out there knows they weren't the only one left bleeding while the world went on pretending it was Sunday. My name is Ava Martinez, and I was 19 when they decided I was no longer mine to keep. At that age, I still slept with a stuffed bear. From childhood, still believed that love looked like the tenderness my parents once showed in photos from before I was born. I had dreams, small ones, fragile ones. I wanted to study interior design. I wanted to travel. I wanted to fall in love with someone who looked at me like I mattered. Instead, I was handed over to Darren Peters. My father said it was a good match. His family had money. Darren had potential. And I was becoming a little too free-spirited. I think what he really meant was that I had opinions. I spoke up in church meetings. I wore jeans that didn't reach my ankles. I asked why my older brother could date, but I couldn't. I remember my mother pulling me aside one evening, whispering that girls like me had to learn to be smart, which really meant silent. Darren was 7 years older, tall, charismatic, in the way that made people forgive his absences. He didn't smile much, but when he did, it twisted slightly, like the kindness never quite reached his eyes. They said he'd been through a rough patch, that he had struggled a bit in high school. But no one said the words meth arrest relapse. No one told me about the night he tried to break into his uncle's garage looking for money, or the girl who left him with a black eye and a restraining order. Instead, they showed me a family dinner. They told me he was clean now. He wore a button-up shirt and brought flowers. I saw the trembling in his hands, the way his knee bounced under the table, like it was wired to something frantic. But when I looked at my father, I saw pride. When I looked at my mother, I saw relief. So I nodded. Our wedding was quiet. No dancing, no laughter. Just church hymns and family friends who clapped too loudly. I wore my cousin's dress because we couldn't afford a new one. Darren didn't touch my hand the whole ceremony. Just placed the ring on my finger like he was ticking off a box. I was 19. I didn't know the difference between nerves and dread, between duty and danger. The first night in our shared apartment, he disappeared. Said he had a headache. Said he needed to clear his mind. I waited. Midnight passed. At 3 a.m., I found him curled up in the back of his truck in the driveway, eyes red, mumbling about things that didn't make sense. I asked if he was okay. He looked at me and laughed. Not kindly, not really at all. That became the pattern. He would vanish for hours, sometimes days. I was told not to ask questions, that I'd only push him away. So I cooked. I cleaned. I folded his laundry with trembling hands, careful not to wrinkle the shirts he never wore. At church, I smiled. At family dinners, I said everything was fine. But at home, the curtains stayed closed. Darren brought in strangers' men with hollow faces and twitching fingers. They smoked in our living room, while I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching my Bible, like it could shield me from the world I had been thrown into. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what they'd say. Marriage is hard. Be patient. He'll come around. Don't shame the family. When I started missing periods, I thought maybe God was giving me a reason to hold on. That a child might be the anchor we both needed. That maybe he'd see the life growing inside me and choose to change. For a few weeks, he was better. He made me tea. He rubbed my back. He called me babe, which I had never heard him say before. I let myself hope. But hope is cruel when it's built on a lie, because soon the mood swings returned. The absence, the paranoia, the rage. He said I was trapping him, that the baby would ruin everything, that I didn't understand what it takes to survive. He said I was too soft, too weak, too judgmental. He threw a plate once not at me, but close enough that it shattered beside my feet. I still have a scar on my ankle from that day, a thin, pale line, like a quiet memory that never stopped bleeding. I called my mother again. I begged her to let me come home. She sighed and said, "You made your bed, Ava." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the kitchen floor, watching the flickering light of the stove's clock, counting seconds like maybe time could rewind if I waited long enough. The next morning, Darren brought home a friend. Said they were going to chill for a bit. Told me to stay out of the living room, but I was tired, so tired. I told him I needed peace, that I was carrying his child, that I deserved quiet. He rolled his eyes. His friend laughed. And when I turned to walk away, someone shoved me. I don't know who. Maybe both of them. Maybe it doesn't matter. I fell hard. There was no scream, just the sound of something breaking. Inside me. I remember the tiles, the taste of blood, the way the world went silent. And I remember waking up in that sterile hospital room alone. Not a husband in sight. Not a mother holding my hand. Just me. Just me. They gave me a form to sign before they wheeled me out. I stared at the line that asked for the father's name. I left it blank. When I stepped out of that hospital, the sun was burning down like nothing had happened. The world went on. Taxis honked. Children laughed. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing music. A song I used to love. I hated it now. I called my mother again, even though I already knew what she'd say. This time, she didn't even answer. I stood on the sidewalk, arms wrapped around my chest, holding the hospital's discharge papers, like they were proof I still existed. A woman brushed past me, wrinkling her nose, as if she could smell the shame on my skin. I don't know how long I stood there before my legs finally moved. I went home. I still called it home then. When I opened the door, Darren was passed out on the couch, shirtless, a needle still tucked between two fingers. The television was on some old movie blasting, but he didn't flinch. The same friend who had been there that morning was gone. Maybe he'd never existed. Maybe they all blurred together, ghosts in sagging jeans, slurring words in rooms that smelled like sweat and burnt plastic. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab something heavy and make him hurt. but I just walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and stood under the shower with all my clothes on. That night, he didn't ask about the baby. He didn't notice I wasn't pregnant anymore. He never did. Days passed in a fog. I started sleeping with the lights on. I couldn't stand the dark anymore. It reminded me of stairwells and hospital ceilings. Darren would disappear and reappear with less and less of himself each time. His eyes became bottomless, his hands more jittery. He talked about big moves, about getting out, about people who owed him. One night, he came home bloody. He said someone jumped him. I helped clean his wounds in silence like a nurse without purpose. He kissed my forehead after and said, "You're good to me." I almost cried, not from affection, but from how low the bar had dropped, that a forehead kiss after months of bruises and neglect could feel like mercy. Then came the raid. It was early, maybe 5 in the morning. I remember the pounding on the door, the shouting, the boots crashing through. I thought it was a nightmare, one of the many I had started to live inside. But it was real. They dragged Darren out in cuffs. They tore through our apartment like it was made of paper. I sat in the corner shaking, holding a kitchen towel to my mouth to keep from screaming. He looked at me once before they pushed his head down into the squad car. Just once. No apology. No fear. Just that same hollow glare I'd come to know too well. They found pills, powder, a small handgun tucked inside the closet where I kept our winter coats. I had no idea how long it had been there. I hadn't worn a coat in months. I hadn't gone anywhere. The police asked me questions, lots of them. I answered with shrugs, with I don't knows, with silence. I think one of them pitied me. He offered me a card for a shelter. I never called it, because even then I wasn't ready to admit I needed saving. Even then, I still heard my mother's voice in my head. "You made your bed, Ava." The apartment was quiet after that, but not peaceful, just empty, echoing. I slept on the floor. I ate crackers and drank water from the tap. I watched the news reports, Darren's name flashing across the screen under headlines like "Local man arrested in drug bust." I wanted to turn it off, but I didn't. I watched it again and again, like maybe if I memorized every word, I'd finally believe it was over. But it wasn't. A week later, his mother came. She knocked like she owned the place, walked in without waiting. Her eyes scanned the apartment cold and judgmental, as if I had brought shame to their name, not her son with a rap sheet. She didn't ask how I was. She said, "You'll need to find somewhere else to stay. This lease is in Darren's name." I stared at her. She repeated herself slower this time, as if I were stupid. "You're not his wife anymore." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to say, "When was I ever?" But instead, I nodded. I packed a small bag that night with 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, and the teddy bear I once slept with as a child. I left everything else behind, even my name in a way. I walked out of that apartment like I was leaving a graveyard, and I never looked back. I didn't go far. Just far enough that no one would know me. Far enough that when someone asked my name, I hesitated because I wasn't sure which version of myself had survived. I found a church on the edge of town. It wasn't grand. Just a squat building with peeling paint and a garden of dying roses. But the woman who opened the door didn't ask questions. She let me sleep in the supply closet. She gave me soup. She called me child even though I didn't feel like one anymore. For the first few days I didn't speak, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't know how to say it without falling apart. There was a mirror above the sink in the bathroom, small, cracked at the corner. I stared at my reflection every morning, like it belonged to someone else. My face was pale, my eyes too wide, my lips always pressed into a line, like I was trying to keep secrets from even myself. One night, I overheard the churchwomen talking in the hallway. One of them said, "She's probably another addict. You can see it in her eyes." Another replied, "Well, we can't save everyone." They never said it to my face, but it stuck. It always does what people whisper when they think you're too broken to hear. That night, I sat on the steps outside wrapped in a borrowed blanket. The cold crept in, but I didn't move. I just looked up at the sky, wondering if God was watching, wondering if he'd turned his face like everyone else. A car passed, its headlights sweeping across my body, and for a second, I felt like I was disappearing. I whispered, "Do you see me now?" No answer, but the stars didn't blink. In the morning, I asked if I could help clean, scrubbed the pews, polished the floor, sorted through donated clothes. I needed to do something, anything, to remember I still had hands, that they weren't only made for bracing falls or catching slaps. One of the nuns gave me an old sewing kit. "You're good at this," she said, after I stitched a torn collar back together. "Where'd you learn?" I told her my grandmother used to sew, that I watched her as a girl, that I used to design dresses in my notebooks before I ever kissed a boy or knew what a needle could do to a vein. She smiled. That was the first smile I'd received in weeks that didn't come with conditions. Soon, I was mending all the clothes they brought in, then designing a few of my own, then teaching a class for other women, most of them like me, fragile, forgotten, full of stories we couldn't say out loud yet. One of them, Carla, asked me one day, "How did you get out?" I told her the truth. I didn't. I bled out, and then I rebuilt. But even as I stitched my way into a new life, pieces of the old one clung to me like dust in old fabric. One afternoon, while shopping for fabric at a local store, I saw Darren's face on the TV behind the register. A mugshot. His eyes were blank. His mouth set in that same half-smirk he used to wear when he lied. "Local inmate found dead in cell," the reporter said. "Suspected overdose. Investigations ongoing." The clerk didn't notice me stop breathing, didn't see my hands tremble. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just stood there frozen in time, as if someone had pressed pause on the version of me that used to be his wife. I left the store without buying anything, walked 5 blocks in silence, sat on a bench and watched pigeons fight over a piece of bread, and then I laughed. Not because I found it funny, but because it was absurd. He got to escape, and I had to carry the weight of his choices for years. The world would call it justice, but it didn't feel like it. Later that night, I lit a candle for him, not because I forgave him, but because I refused to carry his ghost with me any longer. The next morning, I cut my hair. Not a dramatic chop, just enough to feel like something was different. And I went back to the studio. By then, I'd saved enough to rent a tiny space of my own, just a room with 2 machines, some bolts of fabric, and hope I was still too afraid to name. I called the space Erise. No one asked what it meant, but I knew. It meant surviving without apology. It meant building from ashes. It meant never waiting to be saved again. Sometimes I'd hear from people back home. A cousin found me on social media. Said, "We always wondered what happened to you." My mother never called, but I saw photos her smiling at weddings, holding babies, lighting candles in church pews. In all those images, I was a shadow, like I'd never existed, like my suffering had been scrubbed out of their family narrative. Once I wrote a letter. I told her I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I never sent it. Some silences speak louder than confrontation, and mine said everything I needed it to say. I never thought of myself as brave. I didn't escape in the middle of the night with a suitcase and a plan. I didn't stand up in court or scream in someone's face. I didn't write a book or go viral or become the kind of woman people clap for on stages. I just survived. Quietly, messily, day by day. I taught myself how to say no without guilt, how to eat alone without shame, how to smile at strangers without feeling like I owed them anything in return. The studio became more than a workplace. It became a place of rebirth. The walls were painted pale yellow sunlight flooding in every morning. There was music playing most days, soft jazz, or sometimes old Spanish ballads that reminded me of my grandmother. I started designing again, not just mending other people's clothes, but creating things from nothing. Dresses that flowed like water, jackets with hidden pockets, pieces that made women stand a little taller when they looked in the mirror. Word spread. First, it was a client from the church, then her cousin, then someone's friend from a nearby boutique. They didn't know my past. They didn't ask. All they saw was talent and warmth and something in my eyes that said, "I see you. You're safe here." One evening, I was closing up when a young woman knocked on the door. She was maybe 20, thin as a blade of grass clutching a garbage bag full of clothes. She didn't say much, just, "They said you help girls like me." I let her in, gave her tea, let her shower, set her up on the old futon in the back room. In the morning, she cried when I handed her a pair of clean jeans and a soft pink sweater. "It's not much," I said. She looked at me like I'd given her the world. That's when I knew I had become the woman I needed when I was 19. And that was more powerful than any apology I never got. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need a headline or a courtroom or my family's guilt. I just needed to be free. And I was. Truly, deeply, finally free. Sometimes I'd walk past storefronts and see my designs on mannequins. I'd smile, not because of the success, but because they were proof that pain doesn't get the last word, that you can grow gardens from scorched earth, that silence can birth resilience. People ask me now, "Why don't you talk more about your past?" And I tell them, because the woman I am now has already said everything she needed to say. By surviving, would you have done it for her? Would you have left with nothing but a name that didn't feel like yours anymore? Would you have stitched your own life back together, thread by trembling thread? Have you ever been quietly erased by the people you loved most and lived to become someone they could no longer define? I have. And that is enough. I don't have many photographs from before. The few that exist are faded, curled at the corners, hiding more pain than smiles. I keep them in a small box at the back of my closet, not because I need to remember, but because forgetting completely feels like letting someone else write the story. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone I recognize. Not the girl who waited at the top of a staircase for love to change someone. Not the woman who begged her mother to come hold her hand while a doctor explained how a heartbeat had vanished. Not even the stranger who wandered through church doors with blood on her shoes and no name on her lips. I see Ava, the woman who didn't die, the woman who stayed, the woman who grew her own roots from cracked pavement. I never remarried, People ask sometimes. I smile, say I'm already committed to myself, to my peace, to the tiny studio that smells like lavender and coffee and new beginnings, and to the women who walk through my door carrying bruises beneath scarves and silence behind their eyes. I tell them what no one told me. You are not what he did to you. You are not the silence of your mother, the absence of your father, the judgment of your church. You are yours. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they laugh like it hurts. Most times they stay. We sew. We eat. We pray not for justice, but for rest. And in those quiet hours, I feel something close to holy. Not in the way my parents taught me, but in the way a soul stitches itself back together, one tiny act of defiance at a time. They buried him without ceremony. I read it online. No obituary, no vigil. Just a name and a date and a cause. I didn't go. I didn't light a candle that time. I just stood in the doorway of my studio, closed my eyes, and whispered, "You're not mine to carry anymore." Then I went back to work, and the world went on. But this time, it belonged to me. Because sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is live. If you've listened to this far, thank you. This story wasn't shared for sympathy. It was shared because someone out there needs to know survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a woman sewing in a quiet room refusing to vanish. No one deserves to be handed over like a burden. No one should be told that pain is just part of love. And no woman should have to bleed in silence while the world looks away. If Ava's story stirred something in you, anger, grief, or maybe the faint flicker of recognition, don't turn away from it. Share it. Speak about it. Support the women around you, especially the ones who've gone quiet. Because behind that silence, there's often a history no one bothered to ask about. And if you're someone who's still in the dark right now, still afraid, still trapped, let this be a sign. You are not alone. You are not broken. And you are not what they tried to make you believe. You are yours.